Ebenezer. A little bit of a setting here. You have to understand that Samson, at the beginning of this story, is still alive. He's in prison, but he is still alive. A man by the name of Abdon is judge up in the northeast, and he's keeping peace among the Ammonites up there. The Ark of God is under the control of a man by the name of Ebenezer at Kiriath-Jearim. Samuel, Shiloh has been destroyed, and so he lives in a different city. And he sets up an altar there. And personally, I think this is the beginning of having the tabernacle in one location and the Ark of God in a different location. It will stay, for the life of me, I can't figure out why he just doesn't go down and get the Ark and bring it in. But it's one of those cases, it's just not how we've done it. It's been down there for 20 years, and he chose not to change it. They wouldn't come together until Solomon builds the temple, and he brings the two together at that time. Well, you may wonder, when Samuel calls the people together to have a religious ceremony where they simply dedicate themselves to God, that the Philistines would interpret that as an act of war. The Philistines had spies among the Israelites. Of course they did. And the spies looked for one major thing: a religious ceremony. When they heard the news on a certain date, they were going to have this religious activity that always preceded battle. All the kings of that area, every time they were going to go into battle, they would have a religious ceremony first. They didn't know that Samuel didn't have that in mind. So they contacted the Philistines and said, on a certain date, it's going to happen. And so the Philistines decided to join the ceremony. Well, I call this victory on two fronts. Samson bringing down the pagan temple on the Philistine leaders, and the battle at Ebenezer, I hold that they happened at the same time. But even if they didn't happen at the same time, everyone agrees they happened close together. And the results are the same. It was devastating. The Philistine leadership was killed at the temple, and the army was defeated on the field. As they would go into battle, God brought thunder and lightning. That's all he needed to do. He really didn't need to do much more. They were already skittish. They remember what happened 20 years before when they had the Ark of God and they were messing around with the God of Israel, and just horrible things happened. So as they were going to battle, they were already a little bit nervous. They had Samson in prison right enough, but they just didn't like this. And so he just brought a little bit of thunder and lightning. And thunder and lightning is often among the pagan idols, is always a part of the symbols of what they can do. And so they recognized this as being God, and they turned and ran. Samuel calls the victory here, and he sets up a stone, Ebenezer, stone of help. We often focus on the name of that stone as being on his mind, that this is that up to this point, God has helped us. And that's true, but he had another thing. There was another location, also called Ebenezer. And it was at that location that the Philistines had won the battle and had stolen the Ark of God. Basically, Samuel is setting up another stone, and he's calling this where God really did help us, in this Ebenezer. Well, that brought in a time of peace, 20 years of peace. Philistines, they're just backing off. They don't need the mountainous area. They don't even need the hills going up to it. They just backed off. They had the best of everything. They had that fertile soil along the Mediterranean. They owned the Jezreel Valley up in the north. They had the Negev down in the south. They had the trade routes. They were making money hand over fist by all of the caravans that would go north and south. They really didn't need to go up into the mountains and take over that land too. They gave Israel back the valleys and the towns that they took, and they were happy. Besides, for 20 years, they had to reorganize. They had to get new leadership, redo their army. So they were glad just to leave them alone. And for 20 years, Samuel had a time of peace. Near the end of this time, he makes his sons judges. Not in a major way. He's trying them out. He sends them down into a kind of an outpost. Beersheba at that point was just a very small little village down in the south, and he sends them down there, and of course they fail the test, and the people want a king. He was shocked, and so he should be. Now, many people today say, well, yeah, the time of the judges were such a horrible time that they had to do something. Samuel didn't think that. He didn't think the time of the judges as being this awful failure. I mean, he was born during the time of apostasy. But then, as he became a man, he started seeing God working. God working using a flawed person like Samson. He knew what was going on with up in the north with the various judges there. He saw the people turning back to God, and then he saw how God orchestrated this great victory against the Philistines and bringing in a time of peace. God as king, in his eyes, was working. Why would you want an earthly king with all the bother that they are? But that's what the people wanted. They wanted an earthly king. Several things they wanted. They wanted a permanent head of government. They wanted a centralized authority. They would control all the tribes. They wanted a standing army. Well, the permanent head of government didn't work out too well. I mean, Saul was king for a while, and then David took over from him, and then after Solomon, you have the divided kingdoms, and you had kingdoms coming, going. There was time of revival and time of apostasy, just like the time of the judges, except you got a king that's taking everything away from you. You've got a centralized authority over the tribes. Well, good luck on that. They're still battling one another. They're all the time fussing at one another, and eventually they split up and go their different ways. The standing army, that's one thing they for sure got. Wasn't exactly what they had in mind. This standing army took away their freedom. Not only is this army, not only is it expensive, they draft all their sons and their daughters and for helping. They have to provide food for everybody. They have to have housing. They have to have land. They have to have cooks and armor makers, and just on and on. A huge amount of labor just to keep this standing army going. And the standing army turned on them, took away their freedom. Now they had to pay the taxes, and they had to obey the king because there was an army to enforce everything he said. It was as bad as having a foreign king coming in and controlling them with his army, except this was their own king. And on top of that, you have a constant state of war. It's like having if you own a hammer, you start looking for a nail. If you own an army, you start looking for war. And that's what they had, a constant state of war. Having this king wasn't all that it turned out. And Samuel saw all of that. He knew what was going to happen, but he couldn't convince them. Well, they got their king, and that's in the next story. So come back when we give you more insights on the story.